Hey, I want to introduce my dear friend, Jim Steinfeld, who has shot everybody from Michael Jackson to David Bowie to Madonna. And his book is awesome, and I'm honored to be his friend, and he's my favorite rock and roll photographer. So here he is, Jim Steinfeld.
I want to thank Olivia Barish, my good friend of many years. And Olivia, are you around?
I'm right here.
Yay, okay. Of course, Olivia is a star of stage and screen, both the large screen and the small screen. She's a very accomplished actress, writer, director, producer, and I'm honored that you were here and very pleased. That means a lot to me. And we've done many photo shoots together through the years. As a matter of fact, she's a very accomplished musician as well. And I think I first met you when you were performing in the music scene in Los Angeles. Is that correct?
I think so.
And I photographed some of those shows. The next thing that I wanted to do was to thank, of course, the Museum of the San Fernando Valley for having me here today. And in particular, Michael and Lee and Mel for doing all they did to put this together and all they do throughout the year. And I think the first thing I'm going to do is we're going to go through a little slideshow of some of the rock and roll photos I've done through the years. Every picture you're going to see is in my book, Rock and Roll Lens, which I'll be signing for anybody who would like a copy at the end of today's presentation. Today it's not $40. In fact, it's at Barnes & Noble and on my website for $50, that's the retail. Today it's $30 for anybody who wants to buy it, and I'll be giving $5 for every book sold to the museum. And I also give $1 a book for all books I sell to the Make-A-Wish Foundation, which is the #1 charity that I'm involved with. For many years I do their photography for the people who have their wishes fulfilled, and so I'm happy to do that. So let's go and look at a little history of rock and roll, and I'll tell you what, let's have some music too, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And let's see where we start here. Should go. This is music by Beck.
Yeah.
Over there. And of course, you see my picture of Michael Jackson over there. And Madonna. That's I'll talk about that later. And then in the back is a picture I did of Prince around the time that he made the movie Purple Rain. Okay, so let's go through the slideshow. I'll go through this quickly. This is Aerosmith, Madonna. If you can't see in the back, you're welcome to stand or do whatever, but I'll go through this quickly. The Firm with Jimmy Page, David Bowie, Jerry Garcia. Some of these pictures are small, I apologize for that. Of course, Michael Jackson, Tammy Wynette. Let's see, we'll put this up a little higher. The Eagles, Cab Calloway, The Who, Bob Dylan. He's from Minnesota, and so am I, so I have an opportunity to work with him quite a bit through the years. Les Paul, John Cougar Mellencamp, Cyndi Lauper. And I tell stories in the book about all these artists and when I worked with them, and some of the stories are funny, and some are kind of sad, and some poke fun at myself. Elton John, Marilyn Manson, Johnny Cash, James Brown, Warren Zevon, maybe you remember the song Werewolves of London, ZZ Top, Rod Stewart, Elvis Costello, Chuck Berry. He's going to be 90 next year.
Is he still performing?
I don't think so. I think he just very recently stopped performing. Stevie Ray Vaughan, U2, the Rolling Stones, Prince. You see the picture in the back of the room. Sheryl Crow, Keith Richards, REM, Stevie Nicks, Tina Turner, John Lee Hooker, Tom Petty and Bob Dylan, Frank and Sammy on their reunion tour, Robert Plant, the Stray Cats, Paul McCartney, Dolly Parton, Beck, we're listening to his music right now, George Clinton, no relation to the president, Guns N' Roses, Miles Davis, Kurt Cobain of Nirvana, and Courtney Love of the band Hole, of course married to Kurt Cobain, Eric Clapton, George Thorogood, and the Go-Go's, which was one of my first jobs in the business, was working for them. I'm going to read some prepared, thank you. I'm going to read some prepared notes sort of about the history of photography and music and the arts, and then I'm going to take some questions, and we're going to visit about photography and the history of cameras and music and so on.
Jimmy, you going to give us some stories about some of your most fun, favorite photos?
That's correct. One of the ways that I'll wrap things up a little bit later is I'm going to pass a copy of the book around to anybody who has the guts to do it, and you could read. I'll have maybe 4 of you read some of my stories. I always like to hear it in other people's voices, and maybe we'll do some of that. The first thing I'd like to say is that photography and music are both arts. And I have combined the two arts in my book, Rock and Roll Lens. Music, of course, has been with the human race basically forever. Photography, interestingly enough, has really only been around as we know it for about 200 years. And some of the early names in photography are Louis Daguerre, who created the daguerreotype. Maybe you've heard of that. Find these types of things in museums now. And that goes back before the Civil War. That goes back to about 1840. And then there was William Talbot, of course, who used the silver process. And then film photography, which was successfully marketed by this guy, Mr. Eastman, came out with Kodak. And that's a long time ago yet. That would be around before 1900. But we've had film photography for almost that long. Well, and then safety film, which is the film that we really, most people in this room will remember, which was kind of came in canisters like this. And the safety film came out in 1908, and then it was followed by X-ray film, and Kodak, of course, was very big in that. But then, of course, we move on to color photography, which most of the work that I've done through the years, my career, is in color. All the pictures in my book are in color. And I've also done a lot of black and white photography, but I've done more color photography than anything else. And I miss Kodachrome. Any of you are old enough to remember, Kodachrome was very popular for decades. And doesn't exist. This has never been opened, and you can't process it anymore. There's no place in the world that can process it anymore. There are people who can semi-process it to come out black and white. So that doesn't exist anymore. A little bit more on the history, and then I'm going to tell you how it came to be that I ended up doing all of this. Color photography was explored as far back as the Lumiere brothers, who were out of France. And they introduced their color film in 1907. Kodak introduced the Kodachrome I spoke about in 1935. And then in 1963, Polaroid came out with an instant color film. I brought an old Polaroid camera here, which I use this camera sometimes, because they do still make instant film for that camera. Now, of course, the biggest change in recent years in photography occurred right about the time I started doing photography as a living, as a profession. And of course, I'm talking about the switch to digital photography. I did start my career in film, shooting film in film cameras. And everything in my book and all the pictures you see here were shot on film. But pretty soon after I started shooting film, I started to get into digital. And most of the assignments I have now are shot digital. You can shoot a lot more, it's a little less expensive. The clients, everybody wants to save money. And they've come a long way. In the early days it did not look very good. And now it looks great. I still prefer shooting film, so if someone has the budget to do that, I'll shoot film. Now, today, about 99% of the world's photos are taken with digital cameras, most of them, of course, on our smartphones. Which in a way is too bad, but in a way it's good, because everybody can join in the fun of being a photographer, and I think that's great. Now, let me tell you a little something about the actual technical aspects, for me, of doing photography and how my career has moved forward. With regards to the technical aspects of taking a great rock and roll photo like the one you see of Madonna or the one on the back of Prince, it's not that difficult to figure out the technical aspects. What's more difficult is the artistic aspect, and that really requires trial and error. And I've had 30 years of trial and error, so it doesn't mean it's take you 30 years to go through that curve. But when I talk about the artistic parts, I'm talking about things like the framing of the picture, what's in the picture and what's not in the picture. I'm talking about things such as movement, especially when you're photographing musicians on stage, performers. Sometimes you want movement. You want to show movement in the picture. And then also, I guess what I call another aspect of the artistic end would be the subject itself. Do you want the subject in crisp focus? Do you want the background in focus? Or do you want the subject in focus and the background a little out of focus? And of course that takes the viewer's eye and keys it in on the subject. And that we call aperture. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. And then finally, you can also mess around with focus. The actual, if you want to get real arty, you can make the important part of the photograph out of focus, and in the right circumstance, that'll actually lend some art to the photo. Now, what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about my secrets. Would you like to know my secrets of how I get these good photos?
Yes.
Okay. So I've got a little chart here. I'm going to make a little chart here for you. Well, first of all, let me tell you about these cameras. You might want. This is the camera that I'm using mostly today, which is the Canon 5D. And the Canon 5D has really become a standard in the industry. Nikon makes a great camera that's not really equivalent to this, but I like the Canon 5D, and a lot of movies are shot on this camera because it also has a video. Actually, this particular one's so old, it doesn't have video, but the newer ones that look like this, you can shoot a movie on these cameras. Here's my first camera. This is my Minolta, and I talk about it in the book. I paid $100 for this.
Wow.
And I took that picture of Madonna with this camera. So that's kind of cool. This is old school. It's a Yashica twin lens, and many other companies make a camera similar to this, and this shot a square format, a negative, a medium format, and it's a beautiful picture. And you can shoot negative film in this, or also transparencies. And of course, because many of these didn't have a meter inside the camera, you had no idea how much light you needed to have a separate meter. So here's what's now like an antique meter. And you'd hold this next to the subject, and you'd get a reading on how much light there was, and then you could adjust your camera so that the exposure was proper.